nice to meet you. My name is Agathe ROUDOT. I'm working for the African Fund of Funds of Bpifrance, Averroès. I'm happy to be with you today, and today we are together to talk about debt. So maybe to introduce the topic, Africa is 54 countries and 54 different realities. There is a young and dynamic population in the continent, and to give you maybe a key figure, we have between 20 and 30% of MSMEs of the continent that has access to formal credit. So today, equity market is constrained by many things, like limited deal flow, for example, structural risks, and difficulties for exit. So in this context, how does private debt complement equity offerings for entrepreneurs in the African continent? And today I'm happy to be with two professionals of this subject. So Aliénor, who is just here with me, working for Bpifrance, and Zain LATIF from TLG Capital. And maybe I will let them introduce themselves quickly and then go into the main subject.
So, hello everyone, I'm Aliénor DAUGREILH. I'm Vice President Export Finance at Bpifrance. So what is export finance? Export finance helps French exporters to conclude their commercial contracts with their buyer. So we grant loan to public and private entity and also foreign governments. So we finance equipments, assets, infrastructures ranging from 1 million euro up to 75 million euros. So through these solutions, French exporter can securize the payment of their commercial contract by offering a long-term solution to their buyer.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Zain LATIF, and as mentioned by Agathe, I look after TLG Capital. We're an alternative asset manager focusing on sub-Saharan Africa, and our primary focus is on private credit, where we deploy capital into SMEs across the region to help them achieve their goals, and typically it's in the form of long-term patient capital. And I'm sure we'll get more into it as the questions go on.
Sure. Thank you to both of you. So maybe we can start by a global question, and maybe Aliénor, you can start by this question. So what is the context, the global context of debt and equity in Africa?
So if we focus on the SMEs markets, I will give you some figures. So SMEs account for 90% of the business in Africa, contributing to 60% of the labor, the employment in Africa, and while generating between 40% and 50% of the GDP, depending on which country. However, the debt gap, is estimated at over $331 billion. According to a survey by International Development Corporation, more than 70% of SMEs cite access to credit is the main obstacle to their development. Obviously, the level of equity, the track records, the level of the current debt play a key role of obtaining a financing. Nevertheless, in Africa, the landscape, the banking is quite fragile because of a heavy regulation and also a limited access to the liquidity. So maybe to conclude with a highlight on the digital banking can be an answer, or maybe to say that credit export can be an answer, and equity also.
So I think it's a really important question, and I think we heard how the financing gap in Africa is about $330 billion. And when you think about that number, That's what Europe spends on its agricultural subsidies every year. Just that amount is on agriculture subsidies, and this is just what Africa needs. So we have to start thinking in terms of framing the context of Africa in terms of numbers. The total amount of private equity in Africa today, monies raised, is about $7 to $10 billion a year. It's a pittance when you think about the 54 countries, when you think about the fact that whether we like it or not, Africa's population by 2050 is going to reach $2.5 billion. We need to reflect on the notion that the average age in Africa today, in a place like Uganda, is 16 years old. Nigeria, 19. I mean, the previous panel was talking about Norway and France and how you can do trade, and that's great. But the average age in these countries is 42. I mean, the growth is not going to happen here. The growth is going to happen in Africa. There are lots of challenges, and there are broken systems, financial systems that need to be created in order for these flows to come in. But let us not walk away from the fact that in the next generation, you're going to have the young population coming in from this part of the world where, as I said, 2.5 billion people with an average age of 25 by 2050, that's going to be the economic engine of the world.
Thank you to both of you for this nice introduction. And maybe we can continue. And could you explain us a bit about the state of banking landscape in Africa in general?
Yeah, sure. In Africa, you have different sources of financing of debt, which are, you have local loan, and it's also quite common in Africa to have microcredits. You have debt from development institutions. You have also loan programs, loan guarantee programs, and definitely equity, or I mean fund with debt and equity. So there is a lot of the scope and the criteria. It's really different on which institution you are talking about. So I can suggest maybe two options. So export finance, definitely. So if you want to buy a French equipment, we will be delighted to look into it. And secondly, and just to add, that's what is quite common in this landscape is to find a high rate, normally a short repayment period, but also a strict collateral, and finally a complex access administrative process to a finance solution. So the second, I think, tools I can share with you, that I really think that equity, to combine debt and equity, is really key, because behind equity you have fund, and behind fund you have experience and expertise, and I really think that can help SMEs to manage their debt effectively.
So when we think about the banking side in Africa, there are 4,000 banks in the United States, 4,000. Across Africa, we have 600 banks. I mean, we're starting from such a small scale that we have to remember that just by growing at 5–6% a year, which is what we should be doing, you're going to have so much more opportunities. When you look at the developed world, when you get a 3 or 4% growth rate, everybody gets super excited. But the tools to try and generate that same level of growth rate in Africa is not that difficult. I mean, we can talk about some of these issues in terms of how to get there. But I'd like to talk about just leaving you guys with a sense of what the opportunity set is in this incredible market. The total amount of debt from all African governments, and this is, we were talking about how much debt needs to grow, how much credit needs to come into the local economy. The total amount of credit and debt, in Africa, $1 trillion. Every government, all the debt stock. And you look at NVIDIA's market cap of $4 trillion. You look at any of these US market caps of each individual stock, which just tells you that when you're talking about a continent the size 3 times the population of the US, with this young population coming into the place, we need to find the financial tools to help unlock this growth that is going to come. The failure that has happened so far, in my view, is that we have not been able to tap into how to unlock the capital liquidity requirements for Africa to keep growing. And where we've stuck at is people have great ideas, they want to work hard, they want things to work, but if you don't have liquidity, you can't do much. And Eleanor said this in the beginning, where she said most of these SMEs, and we have to remember that as much as people talk about NVIDIA, they talk about Microsoft, they talk about these big companies, what drives US and European growth rates are SMEs. They are the backbone of growth in these economies. These are the ones that are creating the jobs, and we need to find out how do we get these SMEs to work in Africa. But to get those SMEs working in Africa, they need to be able to lend, borrow, get investments, and that's how you grow. It's a very simple formula. The question is, why is it broken? Well, how can we make it to work? And that's something I hope we can talk about as well.
Just now, I think we can talk about the next question. So where is Africa today? And what does it need to address for a financing perspective? And I know you don't have the same point of view, exactly the same, so I think it will be interesting. Maybe you can start.
Yeah, so to start with the debt, just to highlight that borrowing remains a necessary tool to address cumulative crises, but also the climate change issues, the food insecurity, and the conflicts. If we take just a step back, we can talk about the rise of the SMEs represent a response to the imperative of growth in Africa. Each year, 10 of millions of young graduate people enter in the Africa labor market. And governments alone cannot absorb this new demand of skilled jobs. So I definitely think that private sector and industrial sector is the cornerstone of this issue. And I think it's also the answer, or part of the answer, of the issue of the natural resources transformation, which is key to strengthen the economy in Africa. And just to highlight that, to push a little bit the idea that I think Africa has all the key to enhance the sovereignty. I mean by that with all the opportunities, I think Africa can be less exposed to international shocks.
So it's a great question, and where are we today, and how do we unlock what I would like to see is a continued sense of prosperity across African countries and economies. And I think there's a great economist who writes about this, and I think I'll just quote from him, because it all starts with education, which then leads to fertility, which then leads to power generation. And I don't want to go into the empirical evidence, but effectively what I think is the model is you need to get your education levels up to 70% above. If you are at a 70% above, all of a sudden you then have the ability to industrialize. People don't understand that if you can't even recognize script, even a basic education tool, how can you operate machinery? How can you get jobs in factories? There is a statistic that shows that in Nigeria alone, when you complete secondary education in a village, 98% of people leave the village. People leave to go to the cities, and when they go to the cities, they're looking for jobs. Now, when you're looking for jobs, it is directly correlated with access to power. You cannot industrialize without power generation. How do you create power generation? You need to build the transmissions, the power plants. These are huge CapEx projects. But today, if you look at Africa, you borrow money at 10, 15, 20, 25%. Local African rates are incredibly high. When you look at places like China, when you look at places like Morocco and folks that have done extremely well, you'll find that their borrowing rates are incredibly low in the context of the local economy. When you're borrowing at 3, 4%, you can build 20-year projects that's where power comes into play. So it's all interconnected. And then obviously if you have too many children, and the magic number is under 3. So if you have a fertility rate of under 3, all of a sudden families have the ability to start saving. When you have 5 kids, when you get to the end of the work week, you don't have the ability to put money away in the bank. When you don't have the ability to put money away in the banks can't lend to the private sector. And one final statistic I'll give you, because I think it just illustrates the problem. When you look at the developed world, the savings to GDP in France, Germany, 100%. 100%, right? When you look at Africa, it's 20%. So 20% of savings to GDP. When you're running government debt at 50% to GDP, that means the government is soaking up all the savings, which means the private sector doesn't have access to the excess capital. The banks are just happy to lend to governments because the governments have such shortage, they're borrowing at 15%. So if I can lend to the government of Nigeria at 15%, why would I lend to an SME at 18%? So it's a cycle that I think needs coordination between the public and private side. But I think this is just to try and elevate and just explain what we think are the challenges in the markets.
Thank you, Zain. Maybe a last question for both of you. So what are the financial resources, challenges in Africa? And maybe we can start, if you want, with you, Aliénor.
Yes, so I will answer that overall, it's the primary challenge of Africa will be to address the demographic issue by feeding and by employing its population. So to achieve this, the continent will need to strengthen its economy, and I think in fostering the private sector, the industrial sector. To do so, I think they need to improve, I completely agree with Zain, the access to the electricity, the access to water, among other things, but also the business climate with regulation clear and more business-oriented. I think it's really important. There is also a lot of challenges around to address the currency issue, and maybe Zain will speak about it, talk about it a little bit longer. So there is a lot of challenges, and all these challenges should be addressed, taking into account the climate challenge. I think it's really important. And we are talking a lot of challenge in Africa, but it just has opportunities we can find also. And maybe to conclude with a line of thought, that to answer on the financial part, that maybe to create a state bank with a strong knowledge in the local environment, with a lot of tools such as innovation, debt, equity, and normally you know where I'm going now, so maybe like Bpifrance can be an answer to the financial issues.
Yeah, I think the currency topic is absolutely topical, but it comes back to fiscal responsibility. When you're running GDP deficits in the way that you are, your currency is always going to be under pressure, and that is a problem when you're investing in US dollars. But I wanted to say, because I think it's important to end on a very optimistic note, and I just think that despite the fact that there are these challenges, I think the demographics can work in your favor. I do believe the young people population growth rate is going to be phenomenal, and it's going to be a massive boon for Africa. But the one area that I want to give you that Africa has just transcended other parts of the world is in the telecom space. And in 1999, New York City had more phones than all of Africa. By 2010, 11 years, Africa had as many phones as all of North America. It was unprecedented in its growth rate. And what that did was means that most people today, if you go to Kenya and you go to some of these more interesting markets, they're doing their entire banking services on a mobile phone. They've transcended and just left behind the old school banks and more bricks and mortar banking systems. So I do think that if there was more thought given to how do we just do that across the spectrum, not just in banks, but maybe in insurance and maybe in other consumer-driven industries. We can find ways that doesn't need to correspond to how others have done it in the past, but find it that works in the African space. So that's the sort of things that we try and support. That's where we go and finance companies. But this is a very long debate, and this is 30 minutes. It's a very complex issue. But I want to say that it's folks like BPI as well that can just help negate some of those risks. But ultimately, we want to live in a world where taking the risk of an African bank or African corporate is as good as taking JP Morgan risk. And I think that's where hopefully we get to, maybe not in my lifetime, but my kids' lifetime.
And Zain, maybe can you complete like how we can mobilize like local capital, like for real economy, and maybe can you illustrate it with your example of the last project in Nigeria, for example?
No, for sure. And I think very quickly we did the first local credit fund in Nigeria. So we raised from 17 local pension funds. And going to the point about currency, it doesn't make sense raising dollars to invest in Africa. It's a fundamental issue, right? Imagine going at renminbi to go and invest in the United States. Just doesn't make sense. So we've got to find success. And the only way to turn people to invest back in your own country is to have success stories. So I keep telling folks that if you want to drive capital into your own markets, have success stories. People need to be trailblazers. They need to go and be successful. And all of a sudden, they'll have a crowding in effect. It pains me. It genuinely pains me. And I know we have a big crypto digital asset thing going on here, but how crypto companies losing $5 million a month, having revenues of $10 million, will raise hundreds of millions of dollars on the promise of something may happen. And you try to raise money for African corporates and African companies, and you're basically, unable to do so. When you're investing in Africa, it comes across as you're investing in charity. When you're investing in crypto, it's like you're investing in the future. And I don't understand that when, it's to me, it should be the other way around.
Thank you, Zain. Maybe, do we have any question in the audience?
We were very clear.
Yeah, maybe everything was super clear.
Thank you for the presentation. I just have one question. Do you work with the government, the local governments, and some international institutions like the World Bank to improve the situation in the continent?
Yeah, so the World Bank, BPI, they're the anchors in our new fund. So IFC is our largest investor. So we're grateful for their support. But typically, what we're working on and the strategy we're pursuing is working with local banks. So our approach is to go to local banks and say, we want to finance your companies that you like, that you want to support, but you cannot give them the financing they need. When you think about it, African corporates and African banks don't have access to 5 to 7 year dollars, right? Because African banks are financed by short-term deposits, because that's where their natural resources come from. If you are Rio Tinto and you're excavating, you get the money, you put it in an African bank, you keep it for a year, and then you expatriate it out elsewhere. If you want to, therefore, do a long-term CapEx project, a 5-year deal, where does the African bank get 5-year dollars from? It's very difficult. So a lot of financing to African SMEs are very short-term, even though they're doing long-term CapEx stuff. So for example, I'll give you an example of a deal. We just closed a deal where a company had bought a plane in Nigeria. They bought a plane and they were required by the bank to pay back within 3 years. Principal starting a month later. So principal and interest amortizing over 3 years when you're buying a plane that should frankly amortize over 7 to 10 years. Right? So you're getting so much cash flow pressure from the get-go that if you speak to most African entrepreneurs, they'll say, you know what, Zain? Taking money from the bank means I'm working for the bank. And I think anyone here who's working in Europe or the US, if I told you, can you run a business where your cost of capital is 25%, which, by the way, is still lower than what Nigerians are paying. So Nigerians in local currency their average debt is 30 to 35%. And I often say to folks that people don't understand this, but if you can run a compelling, profitable business when you're borrowing at 30, 35%, you're like Jeff Bezos and some of the best entrepreneurs in the world, because that's an incredibly high cost of capital.
Any other question?
Do you have a last word to conclude? Is it okay for you?
Yes, just to conclude on maybe, we didn't talk about it, but we didn't mention it, but the digital finance in Africa, I think it's the future of the finance in Africa, because it's really more agile and really close to the consumer. So I think it will be my last word.
Yeah, I would just say that I think also very important for everybody, and part of what we do as a firm, beyond just investing, is also educating. Because I think the narrative on Africa is extremely poor, and people don't understand and don't take the effort because they listen so much to what the media says, and the media generally just paints a very negative picture. And I don't want to be a conspiracy theorist or anything of that sort, but I just encourage folks to look behind the noise, look behind the numbers, understand that there are some incredibly compelling opportunities on the ground, and you just have to work with the local environment. I think a lot of mistakes people make is take something that's worked in Germany or the US and impose it on the African continent and saying, oh, it should work, and this is gonna, you have to build from the ground up. And I think if people take a long-term approach, and this is also critical, do not look at this region in a short term, I'm going there for 2 years, 3 years, and see what happens. It's a long-term approach, and if you do that, I genuinely believe that the rewards will come, because the demographics, and it really pains me because I see the migration debate and the immigration debate and all that jazz, and I feel like in 20, 25 years, given where things are going in population, we're going to be begging people to come to our countries just to keep up the economy. So it is a timing thing, and I just would like everyone to just walk away just thinking there's more than meets the eye in this part of the world.
Thank you so much. Thanks to both of you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.